Hi there, in this video I'm going to continue looking at the King's Knight opening in Atomic Chess, so one knight f3. In the last four videos I covered the move 2 knight d4, but we've finished with that now, so we're going to move on, and in this video and probably the next two I'm going to be covering the moves 2 e4 and 2 d4. These moves often transpose to each other because white, especially in the main lines of these two variations, will play the other centre pawn forward two squares, and so they often just transpose, especially the way that I'm recommending you play for black. The move I recommend against both of those moves is to play 2d5. I think, I'm pretty sure that this is the best move objectively, and it's also certainly the most ambitious and quite a complicated move as well. There are other moves that are playable. I think the moves 2e6 and 2g6 can be played against both 2d4, and a little bit more risky, but they can be played against 2e4 as well. However, white tends to have a bit more of a say in. He can simply put his two pawns in the centre and develop his pieces and have very good chances of getting a strong initiative. So I think white is better in those lines, but I haven't seen a way that black is losing by force. So you could investigate those if you don't like the variations that I'm going to recommend here. In this video I'm going to be looking at probably like the sidelines of both 2d4 and 2e4. And the way I'm going to structure the three videos is that in the final video I'm probably going to be covering the main line, which is the line with the knight coming to c3 and then white putting both his pawns in the centre. So this could be reached either via the move order I've just shown, or if white had started with 2e4, again developing the knight to c3 and then playing d4. And there are lots of complicated variations there, so that will probably be the third video. In the second video what I'm going to cover is an interesting idea for white, which is a knight g5 sacrifice, and this can be done a number of ways. It can be done immediately here, black takes it and then maybe white plays d4, or it can be done with white first developing the knight either to c3 and then knight g5, or to a3 and then knight g5. So all these knight g5 sacrifices I'm going to cover in the second video. I think it's quite a rare variation to see. I don't see many players play this, or not many players have played against me either, but I do think it's underrated and a very interesting idea, so I think it's worth close attention. It may become popular in the future. And finally, that's probably in the second video as well, I'm going to be covering the line with knight a3 and d4. Unlike the main line with the knight on c3, the knight's not quite so influential on a3. When the knight on c3, white has a lot more ideas of taking on d5 and this knight hopping into d5, which can be very dangerous. With the knight on a3 it's a little bit more sidelined, so it's a little bit more comfortable for black. So in this video I'm going to cover everything else, like I say. So all the sidelines, the lines which they can be tricky but aren't really as critical if black knows what he's doing. And the first one of those I'm going to look at is if white immediately puts both his pawns in the centre. So either e4 then d4 or d4 then e4. And the first thing to note here is that if white thinks he's getting a free lunch and takes on e4, you can really get into a bit of trouble, so I wouldn't recommend black doing that. I mean, white will continue with d5, aiming to play d6, and it might look at first that black can blockade this pawn with the queen. However, after bishop b5, king d8, I really like the move here, king f1. I think there are other dangerous moves and ideas for white here as well, so even if this wasn't available I wouldn't recommend this. But this is really nice. I quite like this because white's threatening queen e1 and then going to a5. For example, if black, say, develops with knight h6, it's not really a very dangerous move, but queen e1, queen e5 to stop the attack on e7. White will then swing over to a5, attacking c7, and then d6 with a winning game. And obviously knight h6 isn't the best move black has, but it's quite difficult for him to actually defend, and I'm not convinced black can actually defend adequately at all. So really that's not good news for black there at all. But instead I recommend the move knight h6. And here, this is a very common counterattack in Atomic. You just see it come up again and again in loads of variations to knight coming to h6, threatening to come into g4, and white will either have to take that or either block for g4 square or counterattack with a knight. Now the counterattacks with a knight here do not really work at all well because knight e5 can simply be captured, and now black has an extra tempo on the previous line. It's very good for black. And knight g5, knight g4, black's gaining tempo on f2, so his knight is the first one to jump into white's position. and white's in quite a lot of trouble there as well. Blocking the g4 square, so h3 doesn't work because simply knight g4 and h5, black's a pawn up for for nothing, so that can't be recommended. And g4, white often does play this g4 idea. Say with a knight on c3 and the pawn on b5 would be a line from what we look at in a later video, which is quite dangerous. But here black has a lot more of a freer hand and can play e5, and I think black has at least a good share of the chances there. So g4 I don't think is particularly dangerous. The most common move is bishop takes h6, but this also has drawbacks because after bishop g4, black's threatening to take on e4 now because he's gaining a tempo on the d1 queen. So e5 is natural, and here I had a game where I was actually playing white against the computer sorted on fix, and I quickly got into a lot of trouble after g6, which really highlights the problem that white has, in that he's given up this dark squared bishop on c1, and now this bishop coming to f8 to h6 is just going to rake through this diagonal and really come into white's position. So white really has to do something about that. So in the game I played bishop d6, so this pressurises the g6 square to stop bishop h6. But after knight c6, now black was hitting d4, and black's just got a very, very good position here. I played c3. I think I was hoping for maybe knight takes d4, queen a4 when you unpin this knight. I'm not sure this is actually, I think this is probably still good for black anyway, but sorted didn't even allow that and played e6. And now knight b4 is a threat because this bishop will then come out to b4 if it's captured. And okay, so this game, I'll just continue this game to show you how much trouble I got into. So queen a4, bishop a3, and here bishop b5, just setting a little trap that if black takes this, then queen a3 wins for white. Of course, sorted didn't do that and just simply castled, and black was already winning this game. So that was bad news for me, but good news for you if you face this variation, because, like I say, knight h6 does look like a very good counter, kind of a complete solution really. So that's really it for pushing to both the pawns. It's quite a trappy line, so you have to avoid capturing that piece, but it's not very popular anymore simply because that antidote is just so good. Another line to consider is 2e4. So this is exclusive to 2e4 if then white continues pushing the pawn to e5. And again, this line used to be played a fair bit, but these days it's not played at all. I mean, bishop g4 here is okay, but I like knight h6, just immediately counter-attacking, and I think black's doing really well here. Again, blocking the knight isn't really particularly good. After h3 again, simply knight g4 is good for black. And if g4, in this case again it can be favourably compared from black's side to the main lines with knight c3 and b5. After bishop takes g4, let's say h3, if you compare it against the variation which we'll cover later with this line with knight c3 and g4, when black takes on g4, which I will recommend, after h3, white has a lot of influence on the centre. But in this case, after we take on g4, white doesn't have that same influence. So after h3 we can even just simply play knight c6 and gain that play over on the queen side ourselves, and it's just looking very, very good for black. One game continued, bishop b5, e6, so black's just developing the bishop to b4. The game went like this. This was a game Liliatov against Sorted. Again, Sorted, the computer program, showing good black play. And rook f8, so now once the kingside's opening up, white's in quite a lot of trouble. That game really finished quite quickly after castle's knight g4, sacrificing to get rid of this defender on h3. And now the queen and rook were both attacking, and white's basically completely busted there. So that shows how quickly it can go wrong for white here. But instead of g4, what most players will play is knight g5. And this is what they're hoping they can get away with, is that after f4, black has to actually be quite careful here, but if he is, I think he's doing very well. The problem is, if white commits this knight with knight f2 after queen f3, I actually think white's doing fairly well, so black should avoid jumping too quickly there with the knight. Bishop f5 is a kind of a thematic idea in these positions, and it's probably okay here. The move I like and I play all the time is c6, and I've won a large number of very, very fast games here because white immediately has to avoid a lot of tricks along this diagonal. So when black's played c6, his queen can come to b6 for quite devastating effect, So for example, if white jumps, let's say knight takes h7, immediately knight e3 is basically winning for black immediately, because you're attacking d1 and f1, and after capturing bishop g4, if the queen moves away, then bishop e2 wins, and if queen f3, then queen b6, and this can't be blocked because it's simply bishop takes f3 with a win for black. And a similar thing happens after knight f7 as well. So first black plays queen a5 because he has to avoid this capture on d8. It doesn't really matter how white blocks it. Let's say b4, knight e3, bishop g4, and again it's the same thing with queen b6. And I'm not quite sure how many games I've won with these similar tactics to this, but too many I think, because white often falls for these tricks, so they're worth knowing. The more common moves, especially from the stronger players, are the move d4. This is played all the time. But bishop f5 is, like I say, it's the thematic move, and it's just quite good here. I mean, if white gives away this knight, then black simply has this g4 knight, which is very strong, without really any compensation. So he's doing very well. And again, if the capture on f6, this knight can't immediately jump because of queen h5, but after e6, now the knight is ready to jump, and the bishop's coming out and castling. Black's just doing incredibly well. So d4 is not particularly strong. One move that has been tried by the very good player Siggy Manon, not exactly in this position. He played it by a different move order with bishop b5 check here, and then knight g5. But it transposes, as in the position we just looked at, white could play bishop b5 and come to the same position. But again, I think bishop f5 is good. These knight jumps, again, don't really work particularly well. Let's say knight f7. Because black's attacking c2, after queen a5 you can capture on c2 and with a winning position. Instead, probably the most natural way is for white to simply block that bishop with d3. And here I've got like just knight takes h2, just keeping that simple. There are some alternatives which aren't bad either. But here, if white jumps in with the knight, then queen a4 and bishop g4, black's getting enough counterplay. If white gives away the queen, then simply, I guess, h5 is looking quite good for black, because white at some point will have to give away the exchange by knight takes h8. Well, I say take the exchange rather than give it away with knight takes h8, but then black will simply be a pawn up with a good position, so that's nothing to be worried about. Instead, white should probably try and keep it a bit more complex by keeping the queen on with queen d2, and when black will have to give back this queen, probably the best way to do it is to take on a2, get lots of material for it. So there is a material imbalance which usually involves some kind of randomness to the position. But in this case, I mean, I think black's doing particularly well. You've got two rooks and two pawns for the queen. White can take the rook on h8, but I would suspect that white players probably wouldn't. They'd probably rather keep that knight for attacking options. But in the meantime, black will basically push his rook pawns, so especially the a pawn, because if white has to open up that file, then the rook will then get active, and once the rooks get active, then I really don't think white's queen will be able to cope with all the pieces. And white's queen itself is going to be finding it quite hard to get active, so I think this position is better for black. Okay, so we'll back up. That was the two kind of most common sidelines that you'll meet. The other sidelines I want to cover are involving the move g2 to g3, and the best way for white to do that is probably with the move d4 and knight a3. And this might look a little bit insipid, but it has been played a lot by the strong player Molten Thinker, and he's played on lots of different sites, and on Fix on ICC in particular, and he likes this line. He plays it against all the strong players and does quite well with it. I recommend knight h6, it's a natural move, again counter-attacking on g4, when white has two main options. So knight e5 I'll cover first. This leads to probably quite a balanced game. Like black certainly equalises, I think, fairly comfortably with knight g4, and then you can simply swap the bishops off. And here I like queen d7. There are other moves as well, but queen d7 is quite good. The idea that if h3 then queen f5 wins material. Instead, white should play e4, seeing that if queen h3 then queen h5 allows white to exchange those queens. But then bishop h6, and black's hasn't got any problems. He's simply developed and doing quite well, so chances for both sides in that position. Okay, so instead of knight e5, the most common move is bishop takes h6, and this leads to slightly more interesting unbalanced positions. Here I like to move bishop g4, and now bishop h3. White's usual idea in this line is to castle as quickly as possible, and then try and play knight g5, especially if black puts the bishop on g4, as I'm recommending. So here h5 is the move I recommend. Playing something like e6 shows white's idea, like bishop d6, knight g5 is a really nice move here, because bishop takes e2. Actually, white ends up in getting a devastating attack on the king with rook e1, and this e-file is opening up, and white's winning that game. So that just shows you, like, you have to be quite careful. But I think h5 is good. So you're immediately coming to h4 with the pawn. So after castles, h4. And you're threatening to take on g3, so white has to be quick and play knight g5. Again, with these ideas that well, of course you can't take here because of checkmate, and also knight e6 would win as well. So you have to be a bit smarter than that, and play e6, so stopping both of those tactics. Now you are threatening to take on e2 and g3, so white has to maybe say play queen c1 or move the knight to h7, I think. And after this, capturing on g3 and playing bishop d6, black gets a lot of counterplay, because if white does try and block this bishop, then g5 comes in, and black's getting plenty of play here, or more than enough, I think. Probably best not to play that and simply to move the h-pawn, but then this bishop will come into white's position, and both sides will have an active minor piece. If instead of queen c1, then knight h7, aiming to attack this and then swap the bishop on g4, then bishop b4 is played when because knight takes b5 isn't possible because of the attack on e2. And now after capturing bishop d2, again both sides have an active minor piece with interesting play. As I say, I think that's the best way for white to play this g3 idea. If he plays it instead with knight c3, then the knight's a little bit looser on c3, because after a future e5, let's say after knight here, let's just play captures, and here let's just say e5. I mean, black can just play e5 quite quickly, and attacking d4, so his knight's more uncomfortable. So that's really the reason that the knight's not so good on c3. Simple as that, really. If white tries to play it without either move, then I quite like the idea of just playing knight c6, because this kind of takes advantage of the fact that white hasn't played the knight out to a3, and let's say b4, now knight h6, and black's doing quite well, as again now even knight e5 isn't possible because the knight takes d4. So white's kind of forced to go into this bishop takes h6 and then bishop g4. We've played similar to the previous line, but in fact in this time it's a slightly better version, because the knight's been developed to c6. Okay, so apart from that, there aren't very many other sidelines worth covering. One line that has been played a few times against me, especially by Molten Thinker, is the move 3c4. I don't think you'll see this very often, if at all. It's kind of like looks like a bit of a Queen's Gambit, in which case I recommend this sort of Albin counter gambit style move e5, threatening to come out to bishop b4 check, and let's say after b4, knight h6. This was a game I had with black against Molten Thinker, and after bishop g4, again a key idea for black is to play g6 and bishop out to h6, taking advantage of the fact that white's swapped off this bishop, and black's already for choice I think here, so it's nothing really to be worried about. If you go to any other lines, I mean we're really kind of scraping the barrel in terms of what white can do. It's best just to play sensible moves if white plays something silly here. Knight e5 would transpose to knight g5 lines, so I just mentioned that. Apart from that, the other key lines will be covered in the next video, so hopefully you come back and watch those when I release them, and bye for now.